The summer of 1848 in the Deep South was relentless. The sun hung heavy over the sprawling plantations, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and cotton. In the heart of one such plantation, whispers began to circulate. A man had vanished. Not just any man, but a slave whose reputation for cunning and endurance had already become legend among those who toiled and suffered under the same cruel system. The news reached the sheriff swiftly. This man had escaped into the night, and the plantation owner demanded his capture. It was not merely a matter of property. It was a matter of pride and fear. To the sheriff, there could be no hesitation. He summoned his 5 strongest hunters, men whose names alone could strike terror into any fleeing slave. They were muscular, relentless, and ruthless, each one trained in tracking, survival, and violence. They carried rifles, whips, and knives. They carried confidence, too much of it. The first night fell quietly over the fields. The hunters moved like shadows through the tall grasses, their boots sinking into the mud. But the man they sought was no ordinary slave. He had studied the land all his life. He knew every hollow, every creek, every thicket that could conceal him. As the hunters closed in, he vanished from sight as if the night itself had swallowed him. By the second night, frustration had begun to seep into the hunters' bones. They had expected a simple chase, a quick capture, perhaps even a show of submission. Instead, they found cunning and patience, a mind that anticipated their every move. He left traces to mislead them, broken twigs, false tracks in the mud, the faint impression of a boot that was not his own. Each trap he laid was small, almost imperceptible, but each was deadly effective in slowing the men down. As the third night came, tension coiled like a serpent. The hunters had cornered him near a dense swamp, the water black and sluggish, dotted with the reflection of a waning moon. They thought the game was over. He appeared before them, but he was not a man waiting to be caught. With deft hands and a sudden motion, he caused one hunter to stumble into the swamp, the others lunging forward only to find themselves entangled in the mud and brush. Pride and strength could not save them. By the fourth night, word of the failed pursuit had reached neighboring plantations. Fear mingled with awe. One man had managed what no others could, and yet the slave did not escape simply to survive. Every move he made was calculated, a silent protest against the injustice that had bound him to servitude for so long. Each trap, each misdirection, was a statement of defiance, a whisper of power to those who still lived in fear under the lash of oppression. The hunters, now weary and humiliated, began to argue among themselves. Their unity had shattered. Brute force had failed them, and the realization gnawed at their confidence. The slave had turned the tables, forcing them into a game they did not understand, a game they could not win. They chased shadows, fell into hidden pits, and were repeatedly outmaneuvered. By sunrise, 2 of the 5 had vanished entirely, dragged down by exhaustion and misjudgment. On the 5th night, the man led the remaining hunters into the heart of the forest, where the moon barely pierced the canopy. He moved silently, almost like a spirit of the land itself, while the hunters tripped over roots, scratched themselves on thorns, and grew increasingly desperate. Every step they took, he had foreseen. Every plan they concocted, he had already dismantled. Their fear became palpable, their aggression reckless. The 6th night brought a dangerous standoff near a riverbank. The slave had prepared for them with ingenuity born of necessity. Simple materials, a fallen branch, mud, and a vine, became tools of his defense. In moments, the hunters were ensnared, their weapons useless, their strength meaningless against the cunning they had underestimated. One fell to the ground, gasping, while the others froze in disbelief. By the 7th night, word of the man's survival had spread beyond the plantation. Stories of his escape and cunning circulated quietly among enslaved communities, and even some free men spoke in hushed tones of the impossible feat for the sheriff and his hunters. However, despair had replaced determination. The hunt had become personal. Their pride demanded a capture, Their egos required a demonstration of power. Yet each step forward seemed only to tighten the noose they could not see. The eighth night brought rain, slick and cold, turning the trails to mud and slowing every movement. The slave used it to his advantage, leading the hunters into the mire. They sank, struggled, cursed, and fought among themselves while he slipped away, unseen, uncatchable. Each failure deepened their frustration and fear. What was strength without strategy? What was might without understanding? The question haunted them as much as the man they pursued. As the ninth night fell, the hunters realized they had underestimated a force they could not measure. One man's mind, sharpened by necessity and survival, had outmatched 5 of the strongest bodies in the county. The chase was no longer about property or law. It was about control, about facing a truth they could not accept, that ingenuity, courage, and what could topple brute force. The 10th night arrived with the hunters exhausted, battered, and wary. They approached a ridge overlooking a dense marsh. They thought they had trapped him, yet silence hung heavy, broken only by the whisper of wind through the reeds. The slave was there, somewhere below, watching, waiting, knowing that the final confrontation was near. The hunter's eyes were wide with fear and uncertainty. For the first time, they understood that their ultimate mistake was not a failure of skill, but a failure to respect the human spirit that refused to be broken. And in that silence, tension gripped the night, leaving the audience to wonder. What would happen when the hunter finally met the hunted? Night had deepened, draping the swamp in a cloak of darkness that seemed almost alive. The air was thick with fog, and every sound, the splash of water, the crack of a branch, the distant call of an owl, was amplified in the hunter's ears. They were men who had faced countless dangers, but now even the bravest of them hesitated. Something in the silence warned them. This was no ordinary prey. The slave moved like a shadow, his feet silent on the soft, wet ground. He had been tracking the hunters as much as they had been tracking him, studying their patterns, predicting their fears. Every misstep they had taken in previous nights had been noted, cataloged, and transformed into an advantage. He understood them as well as they understood themselves. They were strong, yes, but slow to learn, slow to listen to the land, slow to respect what they could not control. By the 11th night, desperation had begun to consume the hunters. The 5 strongest men had dwindled to one weary, paranoid trio. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by exhaustion and doubt. Every plan they made crumbled under the weight of his ingenuity. He was everywhere and nowhere, a force that belonged to the swamp itself. They cursed the night, cursed the man, and cursed themselves for believing they could overpower what they could not see. The slave's traps grew more sophisticated. A simple branch became a lever that sent one hunter tumbling into a hidden ditch. Muddy vines snared another as he lunged forward. Fear took root in their hearts, and hesitation made them vulnerable. Every mistake they made, he had predicted. Every moment of pride or arrogance had been exploited. Strength alone was useless when a mind of the hunted surpassed that of the hunters. On the 12th night, they cornered him near the old mill, a structure abandoned years before. The man had anticipated this too. He used the broken machinery, the wooden beams, the decaying floors to his advantage, moving silently above them while they searched blindly below. The hunters shouted, weapons drawn, but he was already gone, leaving only footprints that led nowhere, evidence of a ghost in their midst. By the 13th night, rumors of his exploits spread beyond the swamp. Neighboring plantations whispered of a man who had defeated 5 of the strongest hunters. Some said he moved like the wind, others that he was invisible in the night. To the enslaved communities, he was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, proof that courage, intellect, and determination could challenge the oppression that had ruled their lives. The hunters, now battered and demoralized, began to fight among themselves. Blame, fear, and exhaustion fueled their arguments. Each blamed the other for failures, for misjudgments, for the humiliation they endured. Their unity, once their greatest strength, had disintegrated. The man they sought had turned them against themselves without striking a single blow. The 14th night brought torrential rain. Visibility was reduced to almost nothing. The hunters trudged through mud and water, every step a struggle. But the slave thrived in conditions like these. He used the rain to mask his movements, to hide his tracks, and to create confusion. When the hunters thought they had found him, they found only shadows and echoes, their frustration mounting. By the 15th night, one hunter had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the swamp, or perhaps abandoned by his comrades in fear. The remaining two were cautious, hesitant, and haunted. They no longer trusted their instincts. Every rustle of leaves or splash of water was a threat. They were no longer hunters. They were prey in a world they thought they controlled. The 16th night saw the slave setting his most intricate trap yet. Using branches, mud, and hidden depressions in the ground, he created a maze of obstacles. The hunters fell one by one, slipping, tripping, and entangled, until only one remained. The survivor realized with grim clarity, this was not about catching him anymore. It was about survival. Strength alone could not save him. Strategy, awareness, and respect for the land. These were the true weapons, and he had none. The 17th night, silence dominated the swamp. The lone hunter moved cautiously, his mind replaying every failure of the past nights. He was exhausted, his muscles sore, his confidence shattered. Somewhere ahead, he knew, the slave waited. But how could one man defeat so many who were trained, armed, and brutal? How could one mind outwit 5 bodies meant to overwhelm? The hunter's breath quickened as he realized that tonight, the ultimate confrontation was inevitable. The 18th night arrived with a strange calm. The swamp was still, the fog heavy. The hunter approached a small clearing where moonlight pierced the trees. There, he caught the first glimpse of the man he had pursued for nights. But the slave stood not as a victim, not as prey, but as a master of the land, of the hunt, and of his own fate. The hunter froze, understanding for the first time the depth of his mistake. Brute force had been useless, pride had been fatal, and the human spirit, unyielding and clever, had won. The 19th night built the tension further, as the hunter realized the traps, misdirections, and intelligence that had undone his companions were only the beginning. The man he hunted had not only survived, but thrived, turning fear into a weapon, knowledge into a shield. Every misstep he made was a lesson, every trap a warning, and the swamp itself seemed to bend to his will. By the 20th night, the hunter was cornered, finally aware that he was facing more than a man. He was facing the embodiment of resistance. Strength alone could not prevail. The swamp, the night, and the mind of one extraordinary man had become an insurmountable force. And as the tension thickened, the audiences left on the edge of their seats, waiting for the inevitable clash that will decide not just a chase, but a legacy. Underscore. The 21st night arrived, heavy with fog and the scent of wet earth. The lone hunter, weary and trembling, stepped cautiously into a narrow clearing. Every instinct screamed danger, yet he pressed forward, compelled by duty, pride, and desperation. The swamp was silent except for the soft drip of water from the trees, a silence that seemed almost alive, waiting. The slave was already there, invisible among the shadows, his eyes watching every movement. He did not need weapons. The night, the land, and his intelligence were his allies. Every trap laid in previous nights had been a lesson in patience. Every misdirection a test of resolve. Now, The hunter was truly alone, vulnerable, and for the first time, afraid. The 22nd night brought the first real confrontation. The hunter lunged toward a sound, a ripple in the reeds, but it was a trap. He fell into a pit concealed by mud and leaves, and the slave's shadow moved swiftly above him, unseen yet omnipresent. The hunter struggled, cursing his arrogance, realizing too late that brute strength could not overcome a mind honed by survival. By the 23rd night, rain had returned, washing away tracks and masking movements. The hunter's frustration grew as he slipped and slid through the swamp, always a step behind the man he pursued. He had learned nothing from the failures of his comrades, and that ignorance would be his undoing. The slave moved like a whisper through the wet grass, guiding him toward another trap, another lesson in humility and respect. The 24th night was the coldest yet. Mist rose from the marshes, clinging to skin and clothes, chilling bones and spirit alike. The hunter thought he could anticipate the slave's movements, but the man had prepared for every possibility. A single false step sent the hunter crashing into a tangle of vines, leaving him gasping, defeated, and increasingly aware that he was no longer the predator. The 25th night brought the first glimpse of despair in the hunter's eyes. He realized he had been outmatched at every turn, not by strength alone, but by intellect, courage, and an unyielding will. The man he hunted had survived impossible odds, turned every advantage of the hunters against them, and transformed fear into power. Pride had blinded the sheriff's men. Now it would destroy the last one. On the 26th night, the slave used the swamp itself as a weapon. Hidden pits, snaring vines, and decoy trails forced the hunter deeper into confusion. He stumbled, fell, and became lost in the maze of mud and water. The swamp was no longer a place to chase. It was a prison, and the man who understood it best held the keys. The 27th night was quiet, almost deceptively so. The hunter, soaked and shivering, paused to rest. That was the mistake. Silence had always been the slave's ally, and now it became a weapon. Shadows moved without sound, branches shifted, and the hunter realized too late that he was completely surrounded. His fear was palpable, his confidence gone. The 28th night marked the final trap. The slave had prepared for this moment, combining every skill, every trick, and every lesson learned from the hunter's previous failures. A simple movement, a snap of a branch, and the last of the strongest men was ensnared, helpless, trapped by ingenuity and patience. Strength had been useless. Force had been meaningless. Intelligence and courage had prevailed. By the 29th night, the swamp was silent once more. The hunters had been defeated, humiliated, and scattered. One man remained, watching the shadows, understanding at last the price of underestimating someone born into bondage, yet unwilling to remain confined. The slave had survived 5 of the strongest hunters, outsmarted them at every turn, and turned fear into legend. The 30th night left the audience with a haunting image. The lone hunter, exhausted and broken, retreating into the darkness, while the man he sought stood tall, unseen but victorious. The swamp, the night, and the silence were his allies, and his spirit had triumphed over the pride and brutality of men who thought strength alone was enough. The story lingered in the air, a warning and an inspiration. Courage and intellect could overcome the most formidable force. And yet, the tension was far from resolved. The man's journey was not over. The hunters had been defeated, but the world beyond the swamp still demanded survival, cunning, and vigilance. The shadow of pursuit would always loom, and the next chapter of this extraordinary tale would test him in ways even the strongest hunters could not imagine. Part 12. Underscore The 31st night arrived with a haunting stillness. The swamp seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the final moments of the hunt were near. The lone hunter, now a shadow of his former self, moved with caution and fear. Every sound, every ripple, every whisper of wind was a threat. He had been humbled by the swamp, by the traps, and most of all by the man he sought. The 32nd night brought a revelation. The hunter realized that his pursuit was not simply a hunt for a fugitive. It had become a confrontation with the indomitable spirit of a man who refused to be broken. Strength and weapons could not prevail against intellect and courage. The slave, watching silently, understood the limits of human arrogance, and he had used them to survive. By the 33rd night, the hunter's desperation was palpable. He stumbled through the marsh, his movements clumsy, his senses frayed. He knew the slave was near, but he could not anticipate where, for the man had become one with the land. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every murmur of water could conceal him. The hunter's confidence was gone, replaced by terror and awe. The 34th night was the first of the true confrontations. The hunter thought he had cornered the man near a twisted oak, its branches like skeletal hands. But the slave had anticipated the trap. He moved unseen, slipping behind, above, and around. When the hunter lunged, he found nothing but shadows. Panic rose in him. He realized that force alone would never be enough. He was facing a mind sharper than any blade. The 35th night brought a fleeting advantage. The hunter managed to spot a movement, a glimpse of his quarry. For a moment, it seemed that the chase might end. But the slave was ready. With the calm precision of a master strategist, he led the hunter into a pit hidden beneath brush and mud. The man's arrogance had been his undoing once more. By the 36th night, exhaustion dominated both pursuer and pursued. The swamp had become a battlefield, not of weapons, but of wits and endurance. The hunter's frustration grew with each failed attempt, while the slave's confidence remained unshaken. Every trap, every misdirection had been a lesson in patience, showing that courage and ingenuity could conquer even the strongest of men. The 37th night was tense with silence. The swamp held no sound but the hunter's labored breathing. The slave observed from a high ridge, unseen, untouchable. He knew the hunter's every thought, every hesitation. This was the culmination of nights of cunning, foresight, and resilience. One misstep, and the hunter would fall again. One wrong move, and he would realize the full cost of underestimating a man determined to survive. The 38th night brought the final trap. Using the natural landscape, the slave created a simple yet effective snare. The hunter, blinded by pride and desperation, stepped into it. He fell, entangled and powerless. For the first time, the pursuit was over. Strength had failed. Force had failed. The ingenuity and courage of a single man had triumphed over 5 of the most formidable hunters in the county. By the 39th night, word of the hunter's failure had reached the sheriff. The defeat was humiliating, yet undeniable. The slave's legend grew with every retelling. Stories of a man who outwitted 5 of the strongest men, who vanished into shadows and emerged victorious. His survival was not just a personal triumph. It was a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope to those still bound in chains. The 40th night left the swamp silent. The hunters had retreated, broken and humiliated. The slave stood alone, victorious yet cautious, knowing that the world beyond the swamp still demanded vigilance. Survival required more than skill. It required intelligence, courage, and the unyielding will to resist. His journey was far from over, but he had proven one undeniable truth. The human spirit could never be imprisoned. The 41st night saw him moving quietly, leaving the swamp behind, but carrying the lessons of the chase. Every trap, every shadow, every night spent evading capture had strengthened him. He was no longer simply a man fleeing his captors. He was a strategist, a survivor, a symbol. By the 42nd night, whispers of his exploits reached neighboring plantations. The story of the man who outwitted 5 hunters spread among enslaved and free alike. To some, he was myth. To others, a hero. and, to the sheriff, a reminder of failure and the limits of brute force. The 43rd night, he reflected on the nights past. Each encounter, each trap, each near capture had been a test. The swamp had been both adversary and ally, a classroom in survival, cunning, and courage. And he had learned well. By the 44th night, he knew that his freedom was fragile, yet his power lay in knowledge and preparation. He would survive because he understood the terrain, the people, and, most importantly, himself. The 45th night brought reflection on the cost of arrogance. The hunter's downfall was not only a triumph, but a warning. Strength without understanding is weakness, and pride without caution invites disaster. By the 46th night, he moved toward new horizons. The swamp that had sheltered him would always be part of him, a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. The 47th night marked the recognition of legacy. His survival, his cunning, his courage, these were not forgotten. The man had become more than a fugitive. He had become a story, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure. The 48th night left the audience with a sense of awe. One man had faced 5 of the strongest hunters, survived impossible odds, and emerged victorious. His tale would echo through generations, inspiring courage in the oppressed and humility in the mighty. The 49th night, as dawn approached, the swamp was calm. He stood, a solitary figure against the mist, a survivor whose mind and courage had triumphed over brute force. And the 50th night, the final scene, closed with a lingering tension. The world beyond still held dangers, still demanded vigilance, still tested freedom. But the man who had outwitted 5 hunters had proven one truth eternal. Courage, intellect, and resilience can defy even the strongest chains. His story was far from over, and the audience was left with a haunting question. How far could one man's spirit carry him when the world itself sought to break him?